We continue with our next section in terms of financial reporting and analysis on the balance sheets portion in Unit 4. And now we discuss the next way of analyzing balance sheets, which is using some sort of balance sheet ratios, right? So typically a balance sheets analysis would basically hinge on two broad parameters. One is essentially the liquidity position of the company. The second is the solvency position of the company. So what are these? The liquidity is essentially the company's ability to meet its short-term financial commitments, or in other words, short-term liabilities, right? That's what the company is supposed to meet in the short term, and that's what ability of the firm is known as liquidity, right? The assessment focus is obviously the company's ability to convert assets to cash quickly and basically use them and to pay for the operating needs using those assets. What are the assets that are easily convertible to cash? How quickly can you convert those to cash? What is the number of those assets that you have with respect to your liabilities? And then try and look at extending that analysis in terms of how good or bad that liquidity situation is. That's the first part of the analysis. The second part of the analysis is the company's ability to meet its financial obligations over the longer term, right? Not the short term, but the long term. That's called as solvency, which is essentially how long can the company remain solvent. When we say solvent, it means it does not default. There is no default on the long-term obligations, typically on the loans, right? The company's financial structure is the key focus here. You have to find out how much debt the company has versus the equity. So how much of the financing is happening from debt and its ability to pay those long-term financing obligations. That's what we have to kind of identify. So how much money does the company make in order to be able to manage the long-term debt that the company has here? These are all short-term liabilities. So liquidity is basically the short-term game. Solvency is the long-term game. Now, how do we analyze this? One of the ways we have already seen, that's the common size statements, essentially, where we can look at this and try and identify some numbers and say, okay, company A has a bigger debt, company B has a bigger receivables or inventory, and so on and so forth, right? The second one would be what is called as balance sheet ratios. Now, these ratios are basically calculated. So there's a numerator and there's a denominator. These are relevant numbers that we will use, and they will give us the position of both the liquidity and solvency. So there is a certain set of ratios that will give us an idea about what is the liquidity position of the firm, and a certain set of ratios that will give an idea about what is the solvency status of the firm, correct? Let's look at them one by one. So if we are looking at the liquidity status, these are called as liquidity ratios. There are three broad ratios that we use. This is called as current ratio, quick ratio, and cash ratio. So if you simply understand what is the current ratio, the current ratio is total current assets divided by current liabilities. Current assets divided by current liabilities. What does this signify? Remember, my short-term liabilities or obligations are nothing but my current liabilities. How much current assets do I have that I can readily convert to cash in order to fund my current liabilities, in order to cover my current liabilities? So the question we are asking is that if all the current liability holders come to the company's doors today and say, please return our money, all the payables guys or all the short-term loans that we have taken, all these guys come out and say, please return our money to us. How does the company basically pay that money, right? For that, the company will need cash or assets that can be readily converted to cash. We treat current assets as those assets, and that's what the current ratio tells us, right? The second and the more stringent ratio is something called as the quick ratio, also known as acid test. So in this, what you do is, instead of total current assets, you take only cash plus marketable securities plus receivables. In simple terms, you are taking current assets minus the inventory and you're dividing it by the current liabilities. That's what is my quick ratio, also known as the acid test ratio. It's called acid test is because it is more stringent now, right? Now what's the purpose of this? If you think about it, out of your total current assets, inventory, it's not easy to sell inventory immediately. What happens if you're not able to sell it immediately, right? So you want to remove that and also try and analyze, okay, receivables I can, let's say, collect because these are my clients and they will give me the money if required. And cash and marketable securities I already have, so I can sell them and immediately raise that money. Inventory I may not be able to offload immediately. So as a more stringent yardstick, I can calculate the quick ratio as well. If you want to become even more stringent, we use what is called as the cash ratio, which says even receivables may be difficult to kind of get quickly. So all you have is how much cash and marketable securities you have versus your current liabilities, right? Now, in general, the textbook definition, or the way we are looking at it, the way we are defining it, it would appear that higher the better. These numbers are higher the better. However, when we do discuss on cash flows, we will realize that this is not necessarily true, right? This is only dependent. So obviously it gives an ability of the company to manage its liquidity, but at the same time, what it means is that a company will, so if I want to maximize the current ratio, I will have to take receivables higher, I will have to take inventory higher, right? Now, the logical discussion would be that a company would not want too many receivables because that's money stuck. You would ideally want your client to pay right away, and a company would not want too much inventory, right? Ideally, you want less receivables and less inventory. That's the broad nature of work. Why do you want less inventory? Is because inventory can become obsolete, right? There is a cost of storing all the raw materials. There is a cost of or risk that inventory becomes obsolete. Let's assume you're a computer manufacturer. You have all the chips that are stored at your end, and you realize new technology comes in and those chips are no longer useful, right? So you want to, in an ideal scenario, also have less receivables and inventory. But what this tells us, what the current ratio tells us, is CA by CL should be higher, which in a way implies that receivables and inventory should be higher, right? We will clear this confusion once we talk about the cash flows. For now, just assume that at least adequate current assets should be there so that you can fulfill your current liabilities. This does not mean that the ratio has to be exactly 2:1 or 1:1 or anything of that sort. We're just saying that obviously it depends on how volatile your current liabilities are, how uncertain your lenders are that they immediately come back to ask for that money, how uncertain or unwilling your vendors are that they're not willing to extend the payables period too long, right? If those are the cases, obviously you need to hold current assets. But if you're a steady going concern kind of a company, like an Infosys or Airtel or one of these kind of companies, then in that context, your suppliers may not really come on a day-to-day basis to ask money from you. They're fairly confident that you will still exist 3 years, 5 years down the line, correct? Surely 6 months down the line. So to that extent, the requirement of liquidity may be different for different industries, and we'll have to evaluate that case by case, right? In general, a firm should have adequate current assets to as to cover its current liabilities. That's what liquidity ratios tell us. The next set of ratios is something called as the solvency ratios. Now, what do we mean by solvency ratios? This is basically going to talk about how much debt a company has, right? So how much debt a company has versus its equity or total capital. So long-term debt to equity ratio will take long-term debt divided by the equity. Then you will take total debt and divided by the equity. right? And then you can take total debt by total assets, debt to capital, which is total debt divided by total debt plus total equity. That's an extension of debt to equity ratio. So debt by equity or debt by debt plus equity. That's the difference. This is D by E and this is D by D plus E. Correct? Financial leverage is total assets by equity. In a way, if you look at assets is equals to total debt plus equity, then you're saying assets by equity is debt plus equity by equity, which is nothing but 1 plus debt by equity. That's called the financial leverage ratio, right? All this basically means that if a firm has too much debt, so too much debt is a problem. You may not be able to repay all that money so easily. So you do not want your debt to equity ratios to be significantly higher. At a separate point in your studies in the next year, we are going to talk about portions around what is the optimal level of debt a company should have. But at this point of time, just try and understand that debt increases a risk for the firm. So the more debt a company has, the more chances there are that it could go bankrupt, right? So obviously too much debt is a problem, but how much is too much? We can always take a look at it in terms of the overall understanding. It's always good to compare all these ratios with respect to the industry and peers, right? So that's the important task that we need to have. Let's try and calculate them for our firms, Cipla and Aurobindo. So we're going to calculate the current ratio, which is current assets by current liabilities. We're going to calculate quick ratio, which is cash plus receivables divided by the current liabilities. And we're going to talk about the cash ratio, which is nothing but cash divided by current liabilities for these firms, right? We have these data points here. Then we will look at debt by equity. We will look at long-term debt by equity. We will look at debt by debt plus equity. And we will look at the leverage, which is assets by equity. And we will look at debt by total assets or total liabilities, correct? In a way, this is already done because you've done the common size statement calculation, right? Those are the firms. Let's try and calculate some of these ratios, right? Remember, current investments are cash equivalents, so they will be treated as cash in our discussion, right? So let's quickly look at some of these calculations. Let's go back to our Excel file and it'll be easier for us to calculate it there. So here we go. We can calculate the ratios here. Let's write down current ratio, quick ratio, and cash ratio for both the firms. Let's calculate that first. So current ratio is the sum of all current assets divided by the sum of all current liabilities, correct? That's my current ratio, and we find that that's higher for Aurobindo. Quick ratio is nothing but we are saying current investments, which is cash, plus trade receivables, plus cash and bank balances, divided by the sum of all current liabilities. We are only taking cash and cash equivalents and receivables. And cash ratio is nothing but current investments plus cash divided by sum of all the current liabilities, right? We calculate this and we drag it on the right side. So on all the parameters other than the cash ratio, we find that Aurobindo is probably higher. It has adequately covered its liabilities, but as I said earlier, it is not necessary that this is a correct analysis in its outset. So we do need to kind of look at those discussions in a more holistic perspective. But broadly, yes, this is liquidity. On a liquidity basis, it appears that on pure liquidity discussion, Aurobindo is more liquid as compared to Cipla, right? Now let's talk about solvency. So we will start with long-term debt by equity. Then we'll calculate debt by equity, total debt by equity. Then we calculate debt by assets, correct? And we can also calculate assets by equity. So those are the broad ones. Let's calculate long-term debt by equity. So long-term debt is long-term borrowings divided by equity. That's the sum of share capital and reserves and surplus, correct? Debt by equity is total debt. So we have to add the long-term ones with the short-term borrowings, correct? And divided by the sum of these two, right? I have put one extra bracket. I'll remove that, and that comes as debt by equity. Debt by assets is the sum, or I'll just add the long and short term. That's long-term borrowings plus short-term borrowings divided by total assets or total liabilities. Anything would do. So we calculate total assets and divide it. Assets by equity is assets divided by the sum of share capital plus reserves and surplus, correct? And we close that. So these are the solvency ratios that we see. And even on the solvency ratio parameters, we will find that Aurobindo seems to be more, so Aurobindo has more debt, correct? That automatically puts your debt to equity and long-term debt to equity as a little bit of a higher number. So here we find Cipla is slightly better on these parameters. They have lesser debt. At the same time, because Cipla has a goodwill amount, obviously assets by equity gets distorted because of those numbers a little bit. But broadly speaking, it seems that both companies do not have excessive risk. On pure liquidity parameters, Aurobindo seems to be better. On pure solvency parameters, Cipla seems to be slightly better, right? That's the nature of analysis that these ratios would essentially help us do. That's the idea of calculating these ratios. You can compare a firm across its history, or you can compare a firm across its peers, right? Let's quickly try one more of these, which is on our Tata Steel numbers. And if you have to calculate the total current ratio for these guys, for example, that's current assets 53,594. So I can take 53,594 and divide it by current liabilities, which is 45,826. So that probably is around 1.2. The current assets cover current liabilities. If I was to calculate the quick ratio, that's going to be only the current investments, receivables, and cash. So that's about 8,700 plus 1,300, that's 10,000, and 23,300 odd approximately, right? Only these three divided by 45,826, and this number is going to be about 0.5 approximately, correct? Then you could look at debt to equity ratio, and you look at the long-term debt to equity ratio. You see that 65,000 crore, 65,675 divided by equity number is about 31,000. Even if you add all these together, because they're kind of, preference share is kind of equity and hybrid securities are kind of equity. If you add all this together, that's still about 35,000 odd. Debt to equity is close to 1.8 to 1.9 long-term debt. And if I take debt to equity, total debt, that includes short-term borrowings as well, that will surely be around 2. Correct? So seems the firm is highly indebted and solvency is a problem. Liquidity is not a problem. Liquidity is fine, but solvency is an issue for this particular firm. That is how you would go about solving for liquidity ratios and solvency ratios for any company and their balance sheet. Right? As we come to an end towards this particular section, couple of quick questions. What do we mean by solvency ratios and what do we mean by liquidity ratios? Take examples and give the answers.